Hello. Welcome to a vlog, because I haven't done one in a while. And I need to lower the brightness on my computer so it doesn't glare. And actually, that's just... Actually, I can't shut that one. Shit. Just make that impossible to say. I love that you can, in fact, darken a computer screen to blackness. That does not seem like a function that it should have. Welcome to a vlog. I'm vlogging because I'm thinking again, and that's never a good thing. Well, here's the thing. Way back when, and it's scary that I can say that, but way back when, I wanted to do a vlog about turning 30, and I'm really glad this thing is in the shot because I would look really weird if it wasn't. It looks really weird even with it in a shot. Anyways, I want to do a vlog about turning 30 because that's like a big thing in your life. You turn 30. It's another decade. You've only had a couple of them so far, and you'll have a couple more, but like, you know, it's a big deal. And I had a bit of a script written up and everything, I think, or actually no, I don't know that I did, but I know I wanted to do one, and I never did. So today I'm going to talk about an aspect of that, like just an aspect of that. It's not going to be the whole thing, obviously, and maybe I'll keep going. But I've been thinking about something lately, and I thought, oh, hey, I haven't done a vlog in a while. Let's talk about it on a vlog, so let's do that. So here's the thing I've been thinking about, right? So life is kind of like life and time especially. Time is like, it's like a log flume. This is the worst way to describe this. Or like a conveyor belt, right? Like you're standing in line, okay, you get put on the log flume, you go off on your ride, and then what happens? More people come and they get put on the log flume, and then they go off on their ride. And I'm finding that that's kind of what life is like. End vlog. Bye. No, and what I mean by that is more and more, I find I'm able to look back. I'm able to look back from where I'm standing and see that I've come a long way. It's like, it's like you're walking up a mountain. It's like when you're halfway up, I don't know that I'm halfway. I would hope not, I guess. When you're halfway up the mountain, you can turn and look down the mountain and you can see, wow, I've come a long way. Certainly from being a day-old child. And I started at a day. Don't ask me about what happened before that. I started at a day. But yeah, it's funny when you can stand on that mountain and look back and you can see things. And one of the things you see is people who are also coming up the mountain. And you sort of look and you're like, okay, interesting. There's people down there. They're doing the same thing that I did. If you're out of high school, you watch people go through high school. If you're like me and you're beyond college, you can look at people go beyond college. And we recently had someone at work who started at the same college that I went to, and I thought about it for a second, and I'm like, boy, it's been 8 years since I've been at that place. It's got to be just a completely different thing, and it's weird to think about that. And it's definitely weird to get to the age where like you can look back on things. And even more than that, it's weird to be able to look back on things and realize how much things have changed. Like I've changed. Okay? And I got a little bit more going on here. I got lots of icicles up in here now, which is not cool. But like I have changed, obviously. But like the world has changed. And if you're younger than me, I know people who are like slightly younger than me are going to be like, I get it, and maybe you do. Maybe you've had this revelation earlier in the day. But if you're like younger than me, you're simply not going to understand what this feels like yet. You don't have the context for this. Like, I remember like as a kid, like adults would tell you things and they're like, you'll understand when you're older. And when you hear that, you're like, I'm fucking smarter than that. I know what it's like right now. And let me tell you something, as someone who's been there, you don't. Because I'm learning that I didn't. Even if I said those things, I didn't understand a lot of things. And a lot of it just has to do with like just being an age. It is the most surreal thing to have people tell you what it was like when you were a child despite the person who is telling you this being like significantly younger than you are. It's really weird to hear people talk about what the 90s and early 2000s were like without really having been there, or having been so young during that time that there's no possible way that they could remember it. You know, it's like I don't know. I rarely talk about the early 90s because I don't really remember that. It's like takes for me to get to like 96 or 97 before I start to know what I'm talking about at all. And that's to say nothing of like, you know, the political climate or any of that shit, because that I don't really have any ideas about, although I think putting some of my memories in context helps me understand. But like, it's so weird hearing people talk about things from like, especially the early 2000s, because let me tell you something, the early 2000s were raunchy. Like, if you weren't there for that, it's like the early 2000s were like this really weird kind of time where everything was sort of like, was like edgy and pushing the limits of like everything. You know, we were seeing just how R-rated our movies could get, and you know, without them being like done. You know, we were seeing how, you know, how weird we could get, how loud, how, you know, it was a very interesting time, and I think that's really like what the 2000s were all about. It was like the new millennium. Here we are, we're in the future, things are different now, and it's like, I feel like the 2000s up until about 2008 were like this really weird optimistic time, in spite of 7/11, in spite of 7/11, no, in spite of like 9/11, because we always lived with that. But I think that was also one of those things that made everything sort of hyper. I feel like it kind of hypercharged your emotions a little bit, because people either had to be like super optimistic or super nihilistic, and like, I don't know. That's just the feeling I get. And here's the thing: even my account of what life was like back then isn't necessarily like completely accurate to what other people's would view, or what even the historians would view. But I know what it was like, and it's the little things that like people I think forget. You know, I think that, you know, there are certain things that we were okay with in the 2000s that we're not okay with now, and like people don't understand that that was okay. You know, back then, and that, you know, even though we don't really do that now, back when we did do it, it was fine and nobody got hurt, you know, and nobody really like, it really wasn't a huge issue. Like, there's stuff like that, and I could get into that, but it'll probably, you know, get me in trouble. But like, it's kind of amazing seeing things at one end and then seeing them kind of push back to the other. And it's like, again, this is really the only thing you can start to understand when you get older and you have people coming up behind you. You have those other people who got on the log flume after you, having their own experiences, and now they feel like, you know, it's their turn to have a voice about it all. And it's like, you know, I kind of get that perspective now. And what it does is, as you look back, it also helps you sort of look forward too, because now you kind of get what the adults were talking about when they said, hey, you don't understand this yet. And you're like, you know what? There are things that I will be unable to understand until I have reached a certain age. And it's like, I kind of get it a little better now. And I kind of accept that there are things that I will not be able to understand until I'm 40 or 50, right? When that new generation is, I guess, even more into it, or there's another one or something, you know, because this is like, you know, and we live in a wild age now, you know, like, we live in an age where truly pretty much everyone can have a voice. It is so unfathomable to think about what life was like in 1995 versus 2010. So, and the reason I make that comparison, and this is a bit scatterbrained, by the way, I'm sorry, but like, I hope you see what I'm saying. So like, back in the late 2000s, when I was in a band or whatever, in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, there started to be this like nostalgia for the 90s. And it starts to make sense when you realize that the people from the 90s were necessarily almost 10 years older. You know, you think about something like 1995. Okay, well, if it's 2008, that's 13 years later. You know, I mean, I was, you know, super young at that point, and then in 2009, I was 17. So I definitely have a greater view on the world, you know. But it's like, it's interesting to see that nostalgia from people who remember the 90s. And now you have these people who come up who can view the 90s without having lived them. And it's this weird sort of situation because they'll look at like movies or media from that time period under a different lens than when it was new, right? So it's weird to see people go like, oh man, Dexter's Lab sucks. I don't know, that's a bad example, but or like, people talk about Pokemon Red and Blue. Okay, Pokemon Red and Blue do suck. I think if you get older, you just kind of understand that. But like, when you're a kid who grew up when they came out, it's like, I know the feeling of what it was like when Pokemon Red and Blue came out. And the kids of today, the kids who have lived through it, the kids who have been born today, the kids who were born in 2003, they can never understand exactly what it was like to live in the 90s, to have Pokemon Red and Blue come out and like change just everything, right? They're never going to be able to live that. They're never going to be able to understand what it was like to, go to the store, to like, sweep your fucking porch, go to the store and buy a single booster pack of Pokemon cards in the hope that you get that fucking Charizard or something. I mean, obviously we can still do that today, but it's just like, I don't know. It's different. They're never going to know what it was like to talk about Missing No, right? Like, that's a crazy thing. It is utterly insane to me that I knew about the Missing No glitch as a kid because, like, we didn't really have the internet at that point. Like, we did, but it wasn't as robust as it is now, and it wasn't as easy to find things. So, like, I don't know. It's just... it's really hard to describe what I'm feeling, but it's so weird, like, to start seeing people talk about a time period in which I lived, like, in this weird negative context. Like, people are assessing it based on the media from that time. Like, they watch something and they say, oh, well, this is, this is aged poorly. And I'm like, no, it hasn't. It hasn't aged poorly. You just weren't around when it came out and no one gave a fuck, Like, you have to have that context around something in order to really be able to explain it. And I think what terrifies me about this is that someday we as people will lose chunks of our history. I'm starting to think about this a little bit, but like when I watch a documentary about like big cats in the savannah, I'm talking about lions, aren't I? Well, cheetahs are also in the savannah, I think. But like, you think about like the current generation of lions living today, right? They have no idea where they came from. Lions don't care about their grandfathers. They probably don't even know their grandfathers. The concept of a grandfather is useless to a lion. And certainly if they don't know their grandfather, they won't know their great-grandfather because lions don't live that long. And lions don't keep records. There's no lion history. There's nothing that they know, There's nothing they know about lions 500 years ago, but humans do. Humans have information about 500 years ago. Humans have an increasing amount of information about what they were like previously because we have the history to back it up. And as the ability to record history becomes more robust, and we can do things like this, vlogging, where you can listen to an everyday guy talk about what it was like to live in the 1990s or early 2000s, you have more details than you ever had before. But you still haven't lived it. You will still view things through the lens of having something that you never had before. Think about something like this, too. Like, again, we're humans. We're only, we have the species and all that stuff. Think about creating a piece of media that is set in the 1700s. Okay, Pirates of the Caribbean was on Sunday. Pirates of the Caribbean was on Sunday. And I thought about it, and I'm like, back in those times, it had to be incredible for a person to know, like, what a French person was like, Like, that's a bad example too. I'm really good at the examples today, guys. But like, it had to be really weird. Like, you had to really know a lot to to be like an intelligent person back in the day. You know, you had to be really fucking cultured. You had to travel like a lot because that was the only way to learn about it. You know, you weren't going to find books about Indian culture in fucking Britain, right? I mean, you would, but you would not much, you know? The best way to learn about it was to go there. There wasn't this knowledge base that you know, people had to, you know, work their way up through in order to start learning new things, right? Like nowadays, it's just we like if we don't know something, we just fucking look it up, and we can just look it up on a phone, which we couldn't do when I was a kid. You know, you had to at least go to a computer and Google it, and before that, God only knows. You know, I never got to the point where I was old enough to seek my own knowledge and want to do it, and like then go like have to go to the library to find out the answer to a question. You know, the only other way that you knew things back in those times, and you know, back before the internet, was if somebody else knew it, you know, and told it to you, which you would just have to take for granted, right? You know, you would have to take their word for it, or you had to live it yourself. There wasn't this knowledge base, right? So like, you know, if you're a pirate, you have to learn how to tie ropes. You know, you can't just go look it up. You either have to learn yourself or you have to learn from someone else who knows it. You know, you can't just learn Spanish. There's not an option for you to just go and learn Spanish. There's no textbooks. There's no class. Like, I don't know if I'm like doing that, but as human history has continued, we've just like accrued this knowledge base that helps us start at a higher level. You know, it's like we don't have to learn about shelter because all we have to do is move into a house, right? It's like you don't have to know how to build your own house. You just have to move into it. You know, you have to be able to afford it, which is a whole other thing. But like, I don't know. It's just like watch a movie from that like takes place in a different period of time from your own, and like think about how life had to be back then, and like not just, oh man, they didn't have iPhones, you know. Like think about like, well, how did they learn the things that they know? And it's like it's so different. And it's like that sort of thing that kind of freaks me out, because eventually, you know, right now we have an abundance of people who are alive on this earth who remember the 1950s. And someday we will not have an abundance of people on this earth who remember the 1950s. At that point, memory of the 1950s becomes really blurry, you know, and we're basing it on, you know, what we think it was like, or we're basing it on accounts of what it was like. Now, the 1950s, of course, is, you know, at the point where there's no one left to actually physically remember it, will be the most well recorded era in human history that no longer has people living from it, because we will have more information technology. And of course, as more people, you know, age and die off and all that stuff, you know, each era, each decade will be remembered better than the one last, because we have more ways, we have more records of it and better ways to record it that are firsthand. But like, it's weird to think that at some point, not only do you die out, but like the history surrounding you dies out. You know what I mean? Like, that's the thing that freaks me out about this whole getting older thing. It's like there are so many people who get it wrong about what it was like to live when I was a kid, right? And I lived it. And it's like, wow. People will understand less and less what it was like as we go on, because there will be more, because I'll turn around and I'll look and I'll see more people on that mountain, and the bottom of the mountain is just unrecognizable by this point, because, you know, so much has changed. You know, what I'm saying is, like, as you get older, you really feel the passage of time, and it feels really weird. It feels really weird to like be able to look back and see these and realize that the young people do not have the same things that you had. You know, it's always weird to hear someone be like, oh yeah, you know, Skyward Sword was my first Zelda game, you know, or Twilight Princess was my first Zelda game. And it's like, wow. you don't remember the big Wind Waker debacle? Like, holy crap. That's so weird. And you know, it's stuff like that, but it's also stuff like, you know, people judging the way the way you were. And it's like you start to see that a lot with history. Like, you know, The 50s and 60s were once viewed as this like very prosperous time in American history, and now if you look around, a lot of people are like, wow, the 50s and 60s were shit, you know? It used to be like this golden age. Like films depicted it as this like really fun time where like everything was great, technology was advancing, we were living easier lives. It's like, you know, we were really getting it, you know? And you know, I think that the truth is somewhere in between. I think maybe the 50s and 60s were bad for a lot of people. There was no air conditioning, so what the fuck? um, you know, there was no air conditioning for anyone, so that automatically makes it worse. But at the same time, like, you could get a job and buy a house, which you can't do these days. Um, so, you know, and it was just very carefree. Every job was sort of like a good job that could support you, and you know, you really didn't. I don't know, what did people worry about in the 1950s and 60s. It's hard to tell because, like, you know, are there that many accounts? I mean, I guess people had to worry about like more diseases and not being able to treat it, but you know what else? You know what they didn't have to worry about? Paying a hospital bill that would corrupt them, that would fucking ruin their life. You know, like, I don't know. It's just, it's an interesting thing to look back on history as you get older because you realize that you're starting to live it. Like when I was a kid, well, when I was in high school, and I was in an AP US history class, we did outlines on every single president up to a certain point. I believe the last one we did was Reagan. So this was in 2008. This was in 2008. And Reagan was president in like when the 80s. So about 20 years ago. You know, give or take, obviously. I'm good at history. I mean, he was right before Bush, so it was like the late 80s. You're looking real good, Funk. But yeah, so if you think about that, that's not too far of a jump from where we are. It has been longer since I was born to 2008 than it has been from 2008 to now. Not quite. I was 16 and I'm not 32 yet, but it's getting there. You know, it has now been, it's now been almost enough time to where it's like, you know, what's the gap there? 20 years? 20 years from Reagan to when I was in, from Reagan to 2008. A little bit more than 20 years, because now I'm thinking about it, about the timeline, and it's like H.W. Bush would have had to have been elected in 88, because Clinton was elected in 92. Okay, shut the fuck up. You're running out of time. So, you know, so what? About 20 years, right? I've lived 20 years now. It hasn't been 20 years since that point in high school, but it's getting closer, you know? When I was a child in the 90s, I thought the 70s were like so many years ago. It was so long ago. They didn't even have computers and computer games and all that stuff. And it's like I'm looking back now and I'm realizing that the 90s are now farther away from me now than the 70s were when I was a kid. And it's like, oh. It's like, oh. And you don't know what I'm feeling right now if you're significantly younger than me. Like you can't possibly know what I'm feeling. Like I can try and describe it to you, but you're not going to get it. It's an experience that only age can give you. And I don't wish it on anyone. Stay young, people. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to try and describe that feeling because it's weird and it kind of gets worse, and I kind of understand why so many old people are curmudgeon-y and against change. Because it's like, I've been here on this earth for 30 years and I know what I know a little bit better now what it's about. And these kids are coming in and they're screaming about what they think it's about and how they think it should be. And I'm like, that's not how it's been. And we survived and you need to quiet down. Like, it's so funny. I like, it's like, I kind of get it now. Like I get why old people are generally more conservative. It's because they've seen enough change. The world changes. It's one thing to realize that you change, but it's another thing to realize that the world changes. You start getting that sense when you're like a teenager. When I was a teenager, the iPhone was coming out. The internet was blowing up. You know, you could have friends across the globe and all that stuff. The world was clearly changing, but it's like where the real change was happening at the time was going to be with the generation that was coming along at that time, who grew up with the iPhone in their hand, who was able to Google anything they wanted at age 6, because I couldn't, you know. And like the implications of that are what really sort of get a little crazy, get a little scary. I don't know if I really explained myself well during this one, but like it's something I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about how at some point we're going to have lost history, and how we lose history as we continue to live it, because as you go on, less and less people who exist understand what it was like to live when you lived, right? Like, it's so weird. And this is to say nothing, of course, about how most of this discourse is happening on the internet. We've never been as aware of like younger generations and what they're into and what power they have over culture and all that stuff than today, because they're all on the internet and they're all sounding off on the internet. And it's like, what a world you people live in, you know? It's like, it's so weird. And I tell you, it's really going to get weird the more people who are unfamiliar with the internet start to move on, or who were like me, familiar with a time without the internet. It's a weird thought, and as I get older, it's something that I'm just like looking at more and more, and I'm like, dang, it's weird. The day will come when I say something about the 90s or early 2000s on the internet, and someone's gonna just like reply to me and be like, you're so wrong, you know, it was awful. And I'm going to be like, it was not awful. Kids today can't fathom what it's like to live in a pre-2008 Great Recession or pre-2001 9/11 world. You know, it's like those sorts of events really changed everything, and you can only see that if you lived through it, you know, if you bridge that gap. Because I tell you, life was way simpler before all that, and before YouTubers. Oh God, that's another thing I was thinking about how many kids today, like if you go into an elementary school classroom and you ask people what they want to be when they grow up, they'll say YouTubers, and it's like, it's happening, you know. Meanwhile, you in your existence were around when YouTube first started happening, and like you couldn't make money of it. When you started being able to make money off of YouTube, it was like, hell yeah, I want to do that. But now it's like you can think about that as a kid. Like, ooh. Again, there's so much to this, and it's very hard to cram it into a vlog like this. But I really wanted to make it because I find it's a very interesting thought. So stay young, don't worry about it, and never look back off that mountain and see where you've come from, because it's weird. But you get a lot of cool thoughts out of it. So I don't know. Stay well.